Listen to the rain. It falls heavy tonight, drumming a steady, rhythmic beat against the glass of the office window. Outside, the gaslights of Paris are blurring into soft halos of amber and gray. The city is asleep. The noise, the traffic, the urgent shouting of the day, it is all washed away into the gutters, leaving only this, the stillness. Come in out of the cold. Close the door behind you. There is a chair here, leather and worn, smelling faintly of old paper and pipe tobacco. Sit down. You are safe here. Tonight, the files on the desk are not filled with violence or terror. We are not here to chase monsters through the dark. Tonight, we are simply observers. We are going to look back at a moment in time, a specific, quiet Tuesday in 1911 when the world woke up to find a piece of its soul missing. We are investigating the impossible theft of the Mona Lisa. But before your mind starts to race, let me tell you the ending. We find her. She is safe. She hangs on the wall right now, behind bulletproof glass, watched by 1,000 eyes. The mystery we are unfolding tonight is solved. There is no danger here. There is only the puzzle. So, let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. We are going to solve this case not with guns or accusations, but with the slow, methodical application of logic. We will look at the dust. We will examine the microscopic ridges of a fingerprint. We will study the patina of old wood and the chemistry of drying ink. We are going to walk through the empty halls of the Louvre, step by step, listening to the echo of our own footsteps on the parquet floor. Let's drift back. The date is the 22nd of August 1911, a Tuesday morning. Paris is waking up under a heavy summer sun, but inside the Louvre Museum, the air is cool and suspended in time. It smells of beeswax polish, turpentine, and the residual dampness of stone that has never quite warmed through. The museum had been closed the day before. Monday was for cleaning, for the slow swish of brooms and the clanking of buckets. But today, the doors are open again. Enter Louis Bayud. He is not a detective. He is not a guard. He is a painter, an artist who makes his living setting up his easel in the Grand Gallery to paint copies of the masters. He is a man of routine. He knows the light in the Salon Carré better than he knows his own bedroom. He walks through the entrance, his wooden case of paints rattling softly at his side. He is humming, perhaps. He is thinking about the light, about the mixture of ochre and burnt umber he will need for the background of his work. He makes his way to the Salon Carré, the square room where the museum's greatest treasures are catalogued and displayed. He sets up his easel. He adjusts the height of his stool. He begins to mix his oils on the palette, the smell of linseed oil rising up to meet him. He looks up toward the wall, ready to greet the lady with the smile. But the wall is bare. There is no panic at first. The human mind does not jump to theft. It seeks a logical pattern. Bayud blinks. He leans forward. Between the dark, heavy masterpiece of Correggio's Mystical Marriage and the soft, Venetian hues of Titian, there is only a gap, a rectangular void. On the wall, staring back at him, are 4 iron hooks. They are stark, naked against the fading red velvet wallpaper. Below them, on the floor, is a faint outline of dust, a silhouette where the frame had rested for years. Bayud assumes the obvious. The photographers. In 1911, the museum was in the process of photographing its vast collection. It was a slow, cumbersome process involving heavy tripods and glass plates. Surely, the Mona Lisa had simply been taken to the studio on the roof. He asks a passing guard, a man named Poupardin. Poupardin is leaning against a door frame, half asleep, the silver buttons on his uniform tarnished with age. The Gioconda, Bayud asks, using the painting's Italian name. She is with the photographers, yes. Poupardin shrugs. I suppose so. They are always moving things. There is no alarm, no sirens, just a muffled confusion. The morning drags on. The sun climbs higher, heating the glass roof of the gallery. Visitors wander in, glancing at the empty hooks, assuming the painting is being cleaned or restored or photographed. The absence is treated as mundane. It isn't until hours later that Bayud, feeling a strange nagging curiosity, a fiber of doubt, asks another guard to check. He wants to know when she will be back, so he can finish his sketch. The guard walks slowly to the photographer's studio. You can imagine the sound of his boots on the marble stairs. Heavy, rhythmic, unhurried. He arrives at the studio. He speaks to the director. The painter, Bayud, is asking for the Mona Lisa. The director looks up from his work, wiping his hands on a rag. We do not have it. You don't? No, we haven't touched it. The guard walks back down the stairs. The pace is the same, but the feeling in the air has shifted. It has become heavier, thicker. When he returns to the Salon Carré, the room is silent. The visitors are whispering. The guard looks at the 4 iron hooks. He looks at Bayud. She is not there, the guard says softly. Bayud looks at the hooks. He looks at the empty space where the most famous face in history should be. The silence in the room seems to stretch, becoming absolute. The Mona Lisa is gone, and yet, the museum does not lock down instantly. There is a surreal, suspended quality to the realization. It is too large a fact to comprehend. It is like looking at the sky and seeing the moon has vanished. The prefect of police is called. His name is Lepine. He arrives, not with a fleet of cars, but quietly. He orders the doors closed. Slowly, the visitors are ushered out. The museum is closing early, the guards say. Their voices low. Please, make your way to the exit. The heavy wooden doors of the Louvre groan shut. The bolts slide home. And now, we are left alone in the gallery. Just us, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of afternoon light, and the empty wall. The investigation begins. But where do you start when a ghost walks out with a treasure? You start with the microscopic. You start with the physical reality of what was left behind. In a service stairwell, hidden from view, lay the only clues. A heavy frame of Italian walnut, ancient and carved, a sheet of glass, and a doorknob. We will catalog these items. We will examine them as if we were there, holding the magnifying glass, breathing in the scent of the old wood. We will slow down the world until the truth reveals itself. So, settle in. The rain is still falling. The city outside is forgotten. We have all the time in the world. Now that the doors are bolted and the city outside has retreated into a dull, gray blur, we must turn our attention to the silent witness that saw everything, the building itself. To understand how a ghost could slip through the walls, we must first understand the anatomy of the Louvre as it existed in the slow, sweltering August of 1911. It was not the gleaming, climate-controlled fortress of glass pyramids and digital sensors that we know today. It was a labyrinth of stone and shadow, a sprawling palace that breathed and groaned with the weight of its own history. Let us walk the path. Imagine you are standing there, in the dim light of a Monday, the day the museum is closed to the public. The silence here is not empty, it is heavy, suspended in the air like the microscopic dust motes that float in the shafts of sunlight cutting through the high windows. The air itself feels different here. It is stagnant, thick with the humidity of a Paris summer, smelling faintly of drying oil paint, the sharp tang of turpentine, and the deep, earthy scent of centuries-old dust that has settled into the velvet drapes. Beneath your feet, the floor is a vast geography of oak. The parquet, laid in complex herringbone patterns, has been worn smooth by millions of shuffling feet, acquiring a deep, amber patina that glows under the gaslight. On Mondays, this floor becomes the center of a rhythmic, methodical ritual. This is the day of the frotteurs, the floor polishers. Can you hear them? They move in a slow, coordinated line, their boots wrapped in thick felt cloths. They slide across the wood, back and forth, a soft, swishing sound that echoes through the empty galleries. They carry buckets of beeswax mixed with lemon polish, a pungent, clean aroma that rises up and mixes with the smell of the old stone. It is a hypnotic, repetitive labor. They work their way through the miles of corridors, polishing the grain until it reflects the paintings above like a dark, golden mirror. If one were to walk from the entrance to the Salon Carré, where the Mona Lisa waited, one would have to navigate a specific, winding sequence of rooms, each with its own acoustic signature, each with its own stillness. Let us trace that route now, slowly, as if we are cataloging the journey of a shadow. First, you enter through the den and wing. The ceilings are high, arched, and lost in darkness. Your footsteps here would sound sharp, a crisp click-clack that bounces off the marble statues of Roman emperors who watch with blank, stone eyes. Then, you ascend the Daru staircase. It is wide and imposing, dominated by the winged victory of Samothrace, a headless angel poised for flight. The stone steps here are cold, worn into gentle depressions in the center where generations of visitors have walked. From there, you drift into the Apollo Gallery. This is a corridor of gold and velvet, lined with glass cases containing the crown jewels. The light here is dimmer, filtered through heavy curtains to protect the fabrics. The silence is muffled, softer, absorbed by the tapestries that line the walls. And finally, you arrive at the Salon Carré. This was the heart of the museum. A square room, intimate yet grand, where the masterpieces were hung frame to frame, almost touching, in the style of the 19th century. It was here, on the wall between a Titian and a Correggio, that the Mona Lisa rested. But on this particular Monday, the routine was broken by a different kind of rhythm. The museum was under construction. Scaffolding clung to the walls like wooden skeletons. The administration was installing a new elevator, and the air was filled not just with the smell of wax, but with the dry, chalky taste of plaster dust. Workers in blue smocks moved through the halls, carrying tools, ladders, and sheets of glass. They were part of the background, silhouettes moving against the windows. They were invisible in their utility. A man in a white smock, perhaps carrying a measuring tape or a bucket of water, would not be questioned. He would simply be another moving part in the great machine of the museum. And amidst this slow, chaotic choreography of cleaning and construction, there was the security, or rather, the lack of it. The guards, known as guardians, were men of habit. Many were old soldiers, retired to a quiet life of pacing the halls. They had a specific cadence to their rounds. They would walk a section, sit on a wooden stool to rest their legs, perhaps smoke a pipe in the courtyard, and then resume. Their movements were predictable, methodical. On Monday, the number of guards was reduced. The vast, cavernous halls were left largely unobserved for long stretches of time. A silence would fall over a wing for 20, maybe 30 minutes, before the slow, rhythmic squeak of a guard's boot would return. It was in these pockets of time, these quiet, suspended moments between the rounds that the opportunity lay. The thief did not need to be a master criminal. He did not need to be a phantom. He only needed to understand the rhythm of the house. He needed to know that the frotteurs would be looking at the floor, that the workers would be looking at their tools, and that the guards would be resting on their stools, lulled by the heat and the quiet. He needed to become part of the architecture. And so, we see the stage is set, not a fortress, but a sleeping giant, murmuring with the sounds of maintenance, blind in its own routine. The wooden panels of the Mona Lisa were sensitive to humidity. The curators knew this. They worried about the damp air warping the poplar wood, but they did not worry about the man who knew how to turn a doorknob without making a sound. Let us pause here in the Salon Carré. Look at the walls. The red velvet is faded. The dust is settling. The room waits. The theft itself was not a moment of high drama. It was a moment of labor. It was a physical task, heavy and awkward. To understand it, we must leave the atmosphere of the room and look at the object itself. We must examine the weight, the dimensions, and the materials that made this theft not just a crime, but a feat of engineering. While the Louvre stood empty and silent, its halls echoing with the questions of a confused public, the center of the investigation shifted to a room that was the exact opposite of an art gallery. We must now enter the office of Alphonse Bertillon. If the museum was a place of beauty and emotion, Bertillon's laboratory was a cathedral of cold, hard logic. He was the prefect of the Paris police, but he was more than a policeman. He was a scientist, a man who believed that the chaotic, messy nature of humanity could be tamed, ordered, and catalogued if one simply had the right tools. To understand the search for the Mona Lisa, you must understand the mind of the man leading it. Bertillon did not trust names, for names could be changed. He did not trust faces, for beards could be grown or shaved. He trusted only the unchangeable architecture of the human skeleton. This was the era Bertillon age. Imagine the atmosphere of his workspace. It was a room filled with the smell of acidic ink, stale tobacco, and the dry, dusty scent of thousands of cardboard file cards. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling cabinets, a vast library of criminal biographies, each one reduced to a series of numbers. Bertillon believed that every human being was a unique mathematical equation. When a suspect was brought before him, they were not interrogated with shouting or threats, but with the silent, methodical application of brass instruments. Let us close our eyes and visualize the process. the anthropometry that was the gold standard of the time. It was a slow, deliberate ritual. The suspect would stand barefoot on a wooden stool, stripped of their shoes and their secrets. Bertillon, or one of his assistants, would approach with a large pair of sliding brass calipers. The metal had developed a soft patina from years of handling, warm where the fingers held it, but cool against the skin of the subject. The measurements were taken with obsessive precision, always in the same order, creating a rhythmic cadence to the procedure. First, the length of the head, measured from the bridge of the nose to the occipital bone at the back of the skull. Second, the width of the head, the calipers sliding tight against the temples to ensure the hair did not distort the data. Third, the length of the middle finger of the left hand, extended and pressed flat against a board. Fourth, the length of the left foot, the subject asked to put their full weight upon it, ensuring the arch was flattened for accuracy. Fifth, the cubit, the length of the forearm from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. And finally, the span of the arms, outstretched like a bird in flight, measured from fingertip to fingertip. Each number was called out in a monotone voice and scribbled onto a card by a clerk whose pen scratched loudly in the stillness of the room. 18.4, 11.2, 45.9. It was a system of beautiful, complex rigidity. Bertillon believed that the chances of two individuals sharing the exact same set of 11 measurements were less than 1 in 4 million. It was a net made of numbers, designed to catch anyone who tried to slip through the cracks of the justice system. But there was a new science emerging from the shadows, a science that Bertillon viewed with deep skepticism, even though it sat right there on his own identification cards. The science of the fingertip, dactyloscopy. By 1911, the world was beginning to realize that the microscopic ridges on the skin of our hands were more than just texture. They were a signature written in sweat and oil. But for Bertillon, this was a messy, unproven art compared to the solid certainty of bone measurement. However, he was a thorough man, and so, on the bottom of his meticulously organized cards, there was a small space reserved for prints. Let's focus on that process. It is a sensory experience all its own. A polished copper plate is coated with a thin, even layer of black printer's ink. The smell is sharp, chemical, and pungent. The investigator takes the subject's hand, the fingers often cold, stiff with tension, and rolls them, one by one, across the metal. The finger is then pressed onto the porous paper of the file card. Roll, lift, roll, lift. The result is a black smudge that, under a magnifying glass, reveals a landscape of complex geography. Bertillon knew the terms, even if he didn't fully respect their power. He knew of the loops, where the ridges flow in from one side, curve around a central point, and exit the same side. He knew of the whorls, the spiral patterns that turn in on themselves like the shell of a snail. He knew of the arches, the simple wave-like hills that rise and fall without looping back. But here lies the tragedy and the quiet irony of our story. Bertillon's office was filled with these cards, thousands of them. They were stored in the heavy wooden filing cabinets that lined the room like silent sentinels. The sound of that room was the sound of the search. Click-clack. The sound of a drawer opening. Shush. The sound of fingers walking through the stiff cardboard cards. Thud. The sound of the drawer closing. It was a library of the underworld, catalogued not by name, but by the length of a foot or the width of a skull. If you were a thief, and you had been measured before, your card was there, suspended in the dark, waiting. And this is where the investigation into the Mona Lisa hit a wall made of its own logic. The thief, whoever he was, had left a mark. We know this now. On the glass case found in the stairwell, there was a thumbprint. A single, clear, oily residue left by a human hand. But Bertillon did not have a system to search by fingerprint. He could only search if he knew the measurements of the man's head or the length of his arm. He had a library with no index for the one clue that mattered. So, the detectives measured the employees. They measured the guards. They measured the frauteurs. They brought out the brass calipers and the rulers. They filled out forms. They created mountains of paperwork that rose like white towers on their desks. But they found nothing. The Bertillonage system, for all its scientific grandeur, for all its brass and polished wood, was blind to the microscopic truth left on a pane of glass. The investigation began to drift. It became a waiting game, a process of eliminating the impossible, while the possible remained hidden in a file cabinet, misfiled or overlooked, gathering dust in the very room where the police chief sat. The rain continued to fall on Paris. The ink on the fingerprint cards dried and became permanent, and the Mona Lisa remained gone, hidden in a silence that not even the most precise measurements could penetrate. We must now leave the lab, with its smell of ink and old paper, and return to the physical evidence. We must look at what the thief left behind, not on paper, but in the stairwell. A list of objects that tell a story of effort, panic, and opportunity. We leave the dry, ink-stained world of the police archives and return to the museum. But we are not in the grand galleries now. We are in the veins of the building. We are in a small service stairwell, the Escalier Visconti, a narrow, winding passage used by the workers and the guards. It is cool here, protected from the summer heat by thick masonry, and the air smells of damp mortar and the residual iron scent of old plumbing. It was here, in this quiet, vertical tunnel, that the investigators found what was left behind. The thief had stripped the painting. He had taken the image, the soul of the object, and discarded the shell. To understand the sheer physicality of this act, we must pause and inventory the items found on the landing. We will catalog them one by one, giving each the weight and attention it deserves, for these are the silent testaments to a struggle that happened in the dark. Item 1. The frame. It was leaning against the wall, abandoned like a piece of driftwood washed up on a shore. This was not a simple border. It was a masterpiece of the Renaissance, donated by the Countess de Behag. It was crafted from Italian walnut, a wood known for its density and its deep, chocolate-colored grain. If you were to run your hand along it, which the detectives did, carefully, avoiding the edges, you would feel the history in the timber. The wood was ancient, seasoned by 400 years of Italian and French air. It was carved with intricate, rhythmic patterns, scrolls, and leaves that had been chiseled by a hand, long since turned to dust. The weight of it was substantial. Without the painting, it was a heavy, awkward rectangle of timber. In the crevices of the carving, where the chisel had cut deep, there sat a layer of grey dust, undisturbed by the violence of the removal. It sat there, a hollow window, looking out at nothing. Item 2. The glass. This was the most telling piece of evidence, for it spoke of the burden the thief had carried. The Mona Lisa was unique among the Louvre's paintings because she was protected by a thick sheet of glass, installed just months before to protect her from vandals. This glass was not the thin, fragile pane of a house window. It was heavy, industrial, and thick. It lay on the floor of the stairwell, unbroken. Consider the sound it must have made when it was placed there, a muffled thud against the stone, followed by the settling silence. Together, the frame, the cradle, and this glass weighed nearly 90 kilograms, almost 200 pounds. The thief had lifted this immense weight from the wall hooks, carried it into the stairwell, and then, with methodical patience, dismantled it. He had removed the wedges. He had slid the panel out. He had separated the image from its armor. The glass reflected the dim light of the gas lamp in the stairwell, a perfect, clear surface that had failed to protect its charge. It was pristine, save for the faint, ghostly smudges of the hands that had lowered it. Item 3. The doorknob, or rather, the absence of it. At the bottom of the stairwell, there was a service door that led out to the Cour des Sphinx, and ultimately, to the street. When the investigators reached this door, they found a small, mechanical tragedy. The door was locked. The brass knob was missing. The thief, seemingly trapped in the stairwell with the painting tucked under his coat, had dismantled the lock. He had used a tool, perhaps a small screwdriver, perhaps a pocket knife, to unscrew the fitting. The knob itself was gone, likely dropped into a pocket or thrown into a dark corner of the courtyard, a piece of brass lost to the city. The empty hole in the door stood as a mute witness to a moment of panic. We can imagine the thief there, in the semi-darkness, his breath ragged, fumbling with the screws while the footsteps of a guard echoed somewhere above him. It is a detail that grounds us. It reminds us that this was not magic. It was a man, sweating and struggling with a mechanical object. And now, we come to the microscopic revelation. The investigators called for the technicians. They did not rush. They moved with the slow, deliberate pace of men who know that the evidence is fragile. One of them knelt by the heavy sheet of glass. He opened a small leather kit. Inside was a jar of fine powder white lead, perhaps, or a fine gray graphite. He took a brush made of soft camel hair and dipped it into the powder. Watch the process in your mind. He held the brush over the glass. He tapped the handle gently. The powder fell like snow. It drifted down through the stagnant air, settling on the transparent surface. It was a suspended moment where the invisible was asked to speak. The technician blew softly on the glass. The excess powder scattered, dancing away into the shadows. And there, remaining on the surface, clinging to the oily residue left by a fingertip, was a mark, a thumbprint. It was faint, a ghostly white silhouette against the darkness of the stairwell floor. It was a loop pattern, located on the edge of the glass, exactly where a left hand would grip it to lower it to the ground. The detective leaned in. He brought his face close to the glass, his breath fogging it for a brief second. Here was the connection, the biological link between the empty wall and the man who walked away. But as we know, in the files of Alphonse Bertillon, there was no way to search for a thumb. The clue was perfect, yet it was useless. It was a key to a library that had no card catalog. So the powder sat there, preserving the ridges of a man's identity, while the man himself sat in a room in Paris, listening to the rain, the painting hidden beneath the false bottom of a white wood trunk. The stairwell fell silent again. The frame, the glass, the empty door, just objects in the dark, waiting to be carried away to the evidence room. While the dust settled in the stairwell of the Louvre, the investigation expanded outward, drifting like smoke into the winding streets of Paris. The police, desperate for a lead in a world without fingerprints, cast a wide, indiscriminate net that pulled in the innocent, the eccentric, and the famous. The dragnet moved slowly toward the Bohemian hills of Montmartre, where the gaslights burned late and the air was thick with ideas and poverty. It is here that we find the names that history remembers, though not for this crime: Guillaume Apollinaire, Pablo Picasso. But we do not need to focus on the drama of their questioning, nor the headlines that splashed across the morning papers. Instead, let us step into the quiet, cluttered atmosphere of their studios, for this is where the investigation briefly paused, confused by its own shadow. Imagine the studio of Apollinaire. It was a space defined by the smell of cheap tobacco, the blue-gray smoke hanging suspended in the air, clinging to the heavy velvet drapes, and the piles of anarchic literature that towered on his desk. The room would have smelled of old paper, that specific, vanilla-like scent of decaying lignin, and the sharp, acidic tang of spilled wine. And then, the studio of Picasso. Here, the air was different. It carried the heavy, pungent aroma of turpentine and linseed oil, the sense of a working painter. Canvases were stacked against the walls, their surfaces rough with texture, hiding faces that looked nothing like the Mona Lisa. The police moved through these spaces, stepping over paint rags and sketches, their heavy boots looking out of place on the paint-splattered floorboards. They opened drawers filled with charcoal sticks and dried brushes. They looked for a woman with a smile, but they found only the chaotic, creative mess of modern art. It was a distraction, a false lead born of panic. While the detectives cataloged the letters of poets and the sketches of cubists, the true answer lay in a room that was entirely unremarkable. We must leave the hills of Montmartre and drift to the 10th arrondissement, to a small, nondescript building on the Rue de l'Hôpital Saint-Louis. We are going to enter the room of Vincenzo Perugia. He was the man who had installed the glass. He was the man with the white smock. And now, he was the man who waited. His apartment was not a studio. It was a cell of domestic simplicity, a tiny room that smelled of boiled cabbage, damp wool, and the sawdust that clung to his work clothes. There was a bed, a small stove, a table, and there was a trunk. Let us focus our attention entirely on this object. It is the center of our story now. It was a simple, white wooden trunk, the kind used by laborers to store their linens and tools. It sat on the floor, unassuming, its surface marred by the scratches and dents of travel, a patina of wear that made it invisible to the eye. It had an iron hasp, cold to the touch. It may have had leather straps, cracked with age, the buckles tarnished to a dull, amber brass. Inside this trunk, buried beneath layers of mundane life, beneath the rough cotton of work shirts, beneath a pair of worn trousers, beneath a few meager personal tools, was a false bottom. Perugia had constructed it himself. He was a glazier, a man who worked with his hands, and he understood how to build a space that did not exist. He had measured the dimensions of the trunk. He had cut a sheet of wood to fit precisely against the sides. He had created a hollow sanctuary, a sliver of darkness between the floor of the trunk and the floor of the world. And there she lay, the Mona Lisa, the poplar panel, wrapped in a piece of red velvet, rested in that cramped, dark space. Think of the stillness inside that trunk. While the police measured the heads of strangers, while the newspapers screamed in bold type, while the ships at the ports were searched by customs agents, the painting was sleeping. She was suspended in a perfect, airless dark. The humidity that the curators feared was now just the ambient dampness of a poor man's apartment. The smile that had captivated kings was now pressed against the grain of a cheap wooden board. And then began the wait. It was not a wait of days or weeks. It was a wait of years. 2 full years. Imagine the seasons changing outside that single window. The autumn rain turning to winter frost, patterning the glass with ice. The spring light filtering in, illuminating the dust motes that danced above the trunk. The heavy heat of another August. Perugia lived his life in that room. He woke up. He drank his coffee. He went to work. He came home. He ate his dinner on the table, perhaps resting his feet on the trunk, unaware, or perhaps all too aware of the history beneath his heels. The city moved on. The outrage faded. The empty hooks in the Louvre became a tourist attraction in their own right. And then, eventually, people stopped looking. The silence in that room must have been profound. There were moments, surely, when he unlocked the trunk, when he lifted the shirts, when he pried up the false bottom just to see if she was still there. We can imagine the sound of the wood creaking, the rustle of the velvet, the faint smell of the old varnish rising up to meet him, a scent of resin and time, alien in this room of sawdust and sweat. He would look at her, she would look at him, and then he would close the lid. Thud. The hasp would click shut. The lock would turn, and the rain would continue to fall on the roof. A rhythmic, endless drumming that washed away the urgency, leaving only the waiting. He was a man caught in a loop of his own making, guarding a treasure he could not sell, could not show, and could not return. He was the warden of the most famous smile in the world, and he was entirely alone. After 2 years of silence, the trunk was finally opened, but not in Paris. We must drift south now, across the Alps, to the city where the story began 4 centuries earlier, to Florence. The date is the 11th of December, 1913. The location is a hotel room, or perhaps the quiet back office of the Uffizi Gallery. The setting does not matter as much as the stillness of the moment. Vincenzo Perugia, weary from the burden of his secret, had brought the painting home. He offered it to an antique dealer, who in turn called the director of the Uffizi, a man named Giovanni Poggi. When Poggi arrived, he did not come with handcuffs. He came with a magnifying glass. He came with the skeptical, methodical eye of a man who had seen 1,000 fakes, 1,000 copies, 1,000 lies painted on canvas. The recovery of the Mona Lisa was not a moment of celebration, but a moment of rigorous, scientific authentication. It was a forensic examination of the past, when the object was lifted from the false bottom of the trunk. Stripped of its red velvet wrapping, Poggi did not look immediately at the face of the Madonna. He looked at the anatomy of the object itself. We must understand that a painting is not just an image. It is a physical body, subject to the laws of decay, gravity, and chemistry. The first test was the wood. Contrary to the popular belief of the time, Leonardo da Vinci did not paint this masterpiece on canvas. He painted it on a single, thick plank of poplar wood, Populus alba, a common timber in the Renaissance, but one that carries a specific, microscopic signature. Poggi ran his hands along the back of the panel. He felt the grain. It was not smooth. Over 400 years, the wood had breathed. It had expanded in the humid summers of the Loire Valley and contracted in the dry winters of the Louvre, creating a subtle, convex warping that no forger could perfectly replicate. He looked for the structural scars. On the reverse of the panel, he examined the butterfly joints, the dovetail inserts made of dark walnut that had been embedded into the poplar centuries ago to stop a crack from spreading. These were functional, ancient repairs, cataloged in the museum's archives, their shapes specific and unique. They were there. The wood held the memory of the carpenter's chisel. Next, he turned the panel over to examine the surface. He brought the lens close to the paint, entering the microscopic landscape of the oil. He was looking for the craquelure. Oil paint is a living skin. As it dries over decades and centuries, it loses flexibility. It becomes brittle, fracturing into a complex spiderweb network of tiny cracks that are as unique as a fingerprint. Poggy studied these fissures. They were not the uniform. Artificial cracks created by baking a forgery in an oven. They were organic, chaotic, and deep. They traced the stress lines of the wood grain beneath. They formed a microscopic map of time itself. In the dark amber valleys of these cracks, dust had settled microscopic particles of history that had been trapped there since the days of Francis I. And finally, the varnish. The Mona Lisa we see today is not the bright, vibrant woman Leonardo painted. She is viewed through a veil of oxidized resin. Poggy examined the patina. He saw the layers of old varnish, applied by restorers generation after generation, which had yellowed and darkened into a suspended, translucent amber. This oxidation had muffled the blues of the sky into greens and softened the white of the skin into a golden, glowing hue. To fake this, to lay a varnish and wait for it to oxidize naturally would take a lifetime. Poggy looked at the sfumato, the famous smoky technique where the edges of the mouth and the eyes blur into shadow without a single harsh line. He saw how the layers of glaze, thin as a breath, had fused together. He stood back. The room was silent. The bells outside continued their slow, rhythmic tolling. The wood, the butterfly joints, the spiderweb cracks, the yellowed varnish, the inventory number 779 painted on the back. Every fiber, every grain, every residual flaw aligned with the records. This was not a copy. This was the exile returning. The wait was over. The science of the object had spoken, quietly and definitively. The end of the mystery did not come with a crash. It arrived with a quiet, polite knock on a hotel room door. When the authorities finally came for Vincenzo Perugia, there was no shouting, no breaking of doors, no sudden violence to disturb the dust of the afternoon. It was a gentle arrest, conducted with the calm formality of the era. Perugia did not run. He did not fight. He simply stood by the window, watching the light change over the terracotta roofs of Florence, and accepted that the waiting was over. He told them, in a voice that was steady and perhaps relieved, that he was a patriot. He claimed he had taken her not for greed, but for Italy to return a stolen daughter to her homeland. The court listened to him. The judge looked at this small man, a glazier with calloused hands who had lived for 2 years in a tiny room with a masterpiece beneath his feet. The sentence was lenient. There was no harshness here, only a sense of orderly correction. 7 months. A brief pause in a life that would soon fade back into obscurity. Justice was served, but it was served quietly, like a book being closed in a library. The chaos was catalogued and filed away. The anger dissipated, leaving only the stillness of resolution. And then, the return began. The Mona Lisa did not stay in Italy. She belonged to the world, and she belonged to the Louvre. She was placed into a secure box, padded with velvet and silk, a dark, soft cocoon designed to absorb the vibrations of the journey. She was loaded onto a train bound for Paris. Listen to the rhythm of that journey. The heavy iron wheels rolling over the tracks. Imagine sitting in that carriage. The landscape of Europe drifting by the window in a blur of gray and green. The steam rising from the engine, suspended for a moment in the cold winter air before dissolving into nothingness. The painting sat in the dark, swaying gently with the motion of the car. Mile after mile, through the tunnels, where the world went black and the sound of the wheels echoed against the damp stone walls. Through the countryside, where the trees stood like silent silhouettes against the pale sky. The vibration was constant, methodical, a lullaby of steel and steam carrying the lost smile back to the place where the silence began. There was no rush now. The urgency had evaporated. There was only the motion, the steady, forward drift toward the north. The rain began to fall again as the train crossed the border, streaking the windows, muffling the world outside until there was nothing left but the rhythm. She was coming home. The journey is over. The wheels have stopped turning. We are back in the Salon Carré. It is night again. The crowds have dispersed. The photographers have packed away their heavy tripods and their flash powder. The journalists have filed their stories and gone home to sleep. The museum is returning to its natural state. Silence. Watch the ritual of the return. Two men in white gloves lift the panel. They move with the reverence of altar servers. They do not speak. The only sound is the soft friction of the wood against the wall covering. They align the iron hooks. The weight settles. The painting is suspended once more. She is back in her place, between the Correggio and the Titian, filling the void that had been empty for 849 days. The men step back. They check the level. It is perfect. They gather their tools. They pick up the cloth. They walk away, their footsteps receding down the long gallery, growing fainter and fainter until they are gone. Now, look at the room. The guard approaches the heavy double doors. He takes a large, brass key from his belt. It is worn smooth by the hands of his predecessors. He inserts it into the lock. The mechanism turns. A heavy, satisfying thud of steel sliding into place. The lights are extinguished, one by one. The gas jets hiss into silence. Darkness fills the room like water rising in a tank. But it is not a complete darkness. It is a soft, blue-gray gloom, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the glass ceiling high above. The dust motes, stirred by the activity of the day, begin to slow down. They drift in the stagnant air. Microscopic satellites caught in the faint beams of light. They settle on the velvet ropes, on the polished floor, on the gilded frames. The stillness is absolute. It is a heavy, ancient peace. The mystery is solved. The questions have been answered. The list of suspects has been burned. The measurements have been filed away. The chaos of the human world, the theft, the panic, the headlines, the trial has all been ordered and put to rest. Everything is exactly where it should be. And there, in the shadows, the smile remains. She watches the empty hall. She watches the dust settle. She watches the moonlight crawl slowly across the floorboards as the earth turns. She is safe. You are safe. The case is closed. Now, we return to where we began. The office is quiet. The files are closed. The ink is dry. Outside, the city of Paris is sleeping under a blanket of gray. The gaslights flicker in the wind, casting long amber shadows on the wet pavement. The world has slowed down. The urgency of the day is gone. There is only the rhythm of the weather. The rain falls on the rooftops. It washes over the slate. It runs down the gutters. It taps against the glass. The streets are empty. The bridges over the Seine are silent. The water flows beneath them, dark and methodical, moving toward the sea. The case is closed. The painting hangs in the dark. The smile is safe. You are safe. If you found peace in this investigation, if the stillness of these old halls helped you drift away from the noise of your own day, then do not leave us just yet. This office only exists because you are here to listen. It is a lonely work, sifting through the dust of the past. It would be a shame to close the door and lose your way back. So, please, subscribe, join us. It is the only way to ensure that when the next mystery arrives, you will be here to help us solve it. We need you here. We will be waiting when the next rain falls. Good night. Rest.